Hello. Over the past few years I've taken you along on various trips to some scrapyards, and I covered that in so far 34 different episodes of my Scrapyard Repair-A-Thon series. Since I happen to live in that particular part of Germany, a lot of that was filmed on my home turf in and around the area of Köln, which is all in all not that far from the country's western border. About a year ago I decided that it was time to focus a little more on projects and repairs revolving around the topic of generating electric power. For that reason, a lot of my videos have combined the idea of repurposing used materials, and in many cases scrapyard finds, with a certain focus on off-grid power generation. In recent months I have worked on fusing these two ideas with yet another field that fascinates me: the history of the Cold War, and in particular the design and manufacturing of tools, machines and equipment made behind the Iron Curtain in what was then called East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, often abbreviated GDR or DDR in German. My interest in these things is by no means coincidental, and I will explain why over the course of this video. But here is what you will see in this episode. Starting from Köln, with an intermediate stop at my parents in East Westphalia, I'm going on a road trip to a mountainous region called Harz. Over there I will visit a scrapyard and also collect stuff from a whole number of private individuals that I have bought equipment from, until the Subaru and my trailer will be packed to the brim with interesting East German equipment. I will spend one night there and hopefully show you some of the interesting things we will see along the way, before we will then drive back and repair a good portion of that equipment in this video. Even more of it will be repaired in one or maybe two follow-up episodes to this one, so let's get going then. But what route will we take here anyway? Well, if you look inside any old German atlas like this one from the year 1970, you will see that the country's borders had been redrawn a number of times. While Germany also lost a number of territories after both world wars, what we will focus on here is the de facto state of the Cold War decades, which essentially meant that Germany was divided into West and East Germany. This map of the major German railroad lines is particularly well suited to understand where we are going, because next to my starting point, the city of Köln, which you might know as Cologne, the town where I grew up called Altenbeken is also on this map. Because even though it's just a small town, its railroad station used to be rather important, so it's on here. These days, whenever I want to make a trip east, I often make a stop here, since it's much closer to the center of the country than Cologne. Earlier episodes, like the one with the water wheel, were filmed here. With the old trailer behind the car, I'm rather slow, so this was a 3-hour drive, and I stayed for the night to visit my parents. The next morning it was still freezing cold and the Subaru was still covered in ice, but I was ready to go. Since this video is about East German equipment, I decided to skip through the West German part of the journey rather quickly. I mostly drove old country roads rather than on the Autobahn. With my trailer I'm slow anyway, and I also often drive the slow roads on purpose. Everyone on German highways seems to think that he is the most important person in the world, and all that matters is that he or she gets wherever first. If you want to decelerate in a stressful world, here's my 2 cents. Take the old country roads and just enjoy the view, also make stops here and there if there is something of interest to see. After driving these country roads for about 90 minutes, I end up on a highway after all. It's Autobahn A38 to be more precise. This road was part of a major project to reconnect East and West Germany after the reunification. This very tunnel is called Tunnel der Einheit, the Tunnel of Unity of Germany, that is of course. And once we leave this tunnel behind us, we are on former East German territory. Of course, looking at things on a surface level, a lot of it is the same now in the East and West, but you can spot typical East German things here and there if you know where to look, even after more than 30 years after the reunification of the country. When it comes to used tools and antique equipment, it still is a completely different world. We will stay on this road for quite a while, but leave it a few times to visit nearby villages where I have bought certain antique items. The first village where we are making a stop is called Kalmerode, and here's our first score. Inside this painter's shop I found an old explosion-protected lamp that is often colloquially referred to as a bunker lamp here. A typical GDR product, they have become a collector's item since they just happen to look really cool. So we load the lamp into the car and we continue on our journey on the A38. About a half hour's drive later, we arrive in a tiny village called Kleinfurra. Here in this garage we have a portable generator of the NVA, the National People's Army of the GDR. It looks similar to the one I repaired in an earlier episode recently, but we will see that it actually works quite differently. I put it in the trunk and off we go. This time I don't go back to the A38 though, but take some old roads to a village called Rossla. On this farm property I find two pieces of equipment that I also already bought online. It is a rather heavy DIY single-axle tractor, seemingly from around the 1960s, powered by a Barkas engine type EL308, plus another much newer replacement engine of the same type. This engine is the bigger brother of the engine that powers the NVA generator. Working on this thing will be a blast, as you will see later in this video. The farmers helped me to push it up a ramp onto the trailer, and with the replacement engine in the trunk, it's back on the highway. After another 20 minutes or so on the A38, I drive through this little town called Allstedt. Along the way I spotted this awesome looking abandoned complex. As I learned later, this was a malt factory that was built in the 19th century. One of the most interesting things when traveling through former East Germany are the many derelict factories, mills and mines that were closed after the reunification of the country. Not far down the road, I also drive by the abandoned copper mine near Nienstedt. Every time you take the nearby Autobahn, you will see the gigantic slag heaps that are left from the former mining operation. Only a few kilometers down the road, I make a stop at a scrapyard that is operated on an area that used to be a former farming collective back in the day. There I find many old engine parts for East German vehicles. The item that I came here for is another small generator though. Made by VEB FIMAC in 1989, it is a product of the last days of the GDR. It has the same Barkas engine as the other generator. After spending a lot of time with West German Sachs engines last year, I decided to learn as much as possible about its much less known and appreciated East German cousin. It's a running theme in this video. After picking up this generator, we find ourselves south of the actual Harz mountain range. In fact, the A38 is also called Südharz Autobahn, South Harz Highway, as it trails the southern edge of the Harz. We are now driving to the other side, to the picturesque city of Quedlinburg, where I will spend the night and have something of a sightseeing tour. To get there I try to actually once again take the back roads over the actual hills and through the forest. On my way I find more amazing abandoned buildings and remnants of the GDR. I also cross the tracks of the Harz narrow gauge railroad, and I only arrive in Quedlinburg about half an hour before sunset, and excuse me while I will enjoy a meal and a good drink in this here tavern. The next morning I got up early and got really lucky with the weather. I had a good old Thüringer Rostbratwurst and enjoyed walking the streets of this marvel of historic architecture. On my little walk I saw tourists from England, Denmark and other places around the world. Quedlinburg is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and from what I hear it has the largest number of timber frame houses in the world. But I had a few more things to pick up at the nearby town of Blankenburg, so it was back on the road. After picking up the two small generators and the walking tractor with the EL308, I also scored a big generator that was used by the East German firefighters as far as I know. It's running on a Barker's EL308 as well. For my next stop, I had to wait a few hours for the owner to come home, so I decided to do some sightseeing in Blankenburg as well. I visited Regenstein Fortress, which is not far from the actual city and allows for a great view. This region here is known as one of the main tourist regions of the former GDR, and especially these small towns on the northern edge of the Harz have a lot of architectural treasures to offer. And after leaving the fortress behind, I drive to a nearby village called Ströbeck. It actually calls itself Schachdorf, the chess village, because, as I learn, it has a history of chess playing reaching back to the Middle Ages. Over here I met an older fellow who used to repair audio equipment professionally here when he was younger. For just 10 euros he sold me various vacuum tube radios and a bunch of other GDR audio equipment. At this point, both the trunk and the trailer got really crowded and I decided it was time to actually drive back to my parents' property in Altenbeken. However, since I still had a number of hours until sunset, I decided to drive my car together with my trailer right through the heart of the Harz mountain range. It would also be a stress test for the Subaru Forester that I bought only a few months ago. On my way, I drove through the beautiful town of Wernigerode. I would like to return here with more time later. For now I had to keep going though, so I drove up hills and down hills and through the Harz forest. Unfortunately, a lot of the spruce tree population has been absolutely decimated over the past few years here. I have talked about this a number of times in my videos. Ongoing droughts and warm summers have weakened the trees to a point where they were no longer able to defend against an onslaught of little beetles that naturally live under their bark. Their unusually explosive population growth combined with the weakened defenses of the trees has completely devastated vast stretches of forest all over this country. We actually saw this in my old hometown earlier. But here in the Harz region it is even much worse. And here's a rather important spot. I actually turned around to show you the sign. Here in the forest was the historic border between East and West, and the sign says, Germany and Europe were divided at this point until 2:30 p.m. on November 12, 1989. Today the forests all around this area are devastated, and it feels like a real-life dystopia. Now, these types of trees didn't really belong here in the first place, and certainly not in this kind of monoculture. But as someone who grew up in a forest just like this, I left this place in a somber mood and full of worries. It felt as if the last few spots where an old soul could still find some peace were quickly vanishing from this world. However, it will hopefully only take a few years for new trees to grow back, like this young birch forest that is now growing here after a storm devastated the spruce trees some 20 years ago. Other parts of the forest of the Harz are still more intact with other types of trees growing there, though, and I will have to return to do more exploration and probably some hiking in the future. For now, I was driving back home to East Westphalia, looking forward to start with the repairs the next morning. Let us briefly sum up and identify all the items I bought on this trip then. Item: bunker lamp type 29.2. Manufacturer: VEB Leuchtenbau Wittenberg. Year 1987. Item: generator type ECB 1.62. Manufacturer: VEB FIMAG Finsterwalder Maschinenbau. Year 1983. Item: single axle tractor, DIY. Manufacturers: various. Year around 1965. Item: two-stroke engine Barkas EL308. Manufacturer: VEB Barkas Werke Karl-Marx-Stadt. Year 1989. Item: generator type Stromer 85. Manufacturer: VEB FIMAG Finsterwalde. Year 1989. Generator type EGBS 32. Manufacturer: also VEB FIMAG. Year 1973. Item: various audio equipment. Manufacturers, and it's impressive how many different factories existed here: VEB Sternradio Rochlitz, VEB Sternradio Berlin, VEB Sachsenwerk Niedersedlitz, VEB Funkwerk Zittau, and the odd one out, Elprom, Bulgaria. Since this is way too much to cover in just one video, we will have to focus on some related repairs for this episode. The goal for this video is to restore the two small generators and also the replacement EL308 engine, and then also get the tractor in running condition and actually run it in my garden. At least 2 follow-up videos will have to be made, repairing the big generator and building a trailer or sulky for the single axle tractor so I can ride it around. And on the long run it would be nice to also take care of the other items, of course. Let's start with the 2 smaller generators then. We will repair them alongside each other. This will help in comparing the similarities and understanding the different approaches a little better. We start by inspecting and disassembling the smaller unit. The name Stromer is basically a colloquial term for a generator, while 85, as far as I know, refers to the year 1985, which is when this model first came on the market. This particular specimen was made in December 1989. That was the month after the Berlin Wall fell. The GDR technically still existed, but was falling apart rather rapidly. The actual electric generator was made in the GDR as well, but by a different company, and it is a completely different type of generator than in the other devices, and I will talk more about this in a few minutes. The Barkas engine type EL150 was also made in 1989. In a recent episode, I worked on the same engine, but made in 1963. From today's perspective, it is almost unbelievable that the same product was still being manufactured 36 years later. Remember, this is the newest of all the items, and it's still already 34 years old. With something this old, it isn't enough to just somehow get it running again. It needs to be looked at from all angles. That is at least my opinion. To get more access, I remove the air filter and the gas tank first. Under the gas tank, we can see that the generator has cooling fins all around. They are clogged by dirt and cobwebs though. We can also see 2 large capacitors connected to it. After pulling off the dirty carburetor, we can see that everything is coated in a layer of grime. And these are the nuts we have to get to detach the Barkas engine. To reach all the nuts, I have to take off the muffler as well. And you can see a general design trend here that actually persists to this day. While the old generators that were designed in the 1950s, 60s, 70s have lots of round shapes, like a cylindrical gas tank, round air filters and mufflers, there eventually was a trend to convert everything into a box shape. It probably happened to make these devices more compact in design, but at least in my opinion, the older designs dominated by round shapes just look much better. After taking off the engine, I spray all surfaces with a degreaser and wipe off all the grime with a steel sponge. This combination works really well. After that, I use a wet rag to wash it all off. In my opinion, it is really important to do this before actually opening the engine and work on the ignition. We don't want the grease and grime and crumbly dirt to come in contact with the ignition system. With the engine detached, I can also clean up the rest of the generator and it already looks much better. Before we will proceed to the actual repairs, let's take the other generator apart as well. This unit was built in 1983 for the armed forces of the GDR, but it simply is an updated version of a much older design. In fact, we worked on the predecessor in a recent video. It was made in 1963, and we will talk about some of the technical differences in just a minute. It is rated at 1.6 kVA, which is just a little more than the Stromer 85, which is a 1.3 kVA unit. According to this hour meter, it has only seen about 27 hours of service, which is really not that much at all. While that smaller device can be carried around by one person, this military generator is too heavy for that, and that's why I will disassemble it here in the trunk before working on its individual components. With the sled removed, I once again need to detach this engine as well. As usual, a lot of parts are in the way, of course. The carburetor is taken off, and so is the old muffler, which will certainly need a new paint job. I eventually unscrew the engine, and the smaller parts are now much easier to work on. I also open the electrical enclosure, and we can already see that we find a very different situation than inside the older version from 1963 that I worked on before. The transformer core has some rust, and we will remove that. I'm pretty sure though that it still works nonetheless. The next detail that caught my eye is that there is a rectifier bridge integrated into the housing of the synchronous generator. Another difference to the older version. Inside we find 3 slip rings and 3 sets of brushes. The brushes are still in good condition, and there is a lot of material left on them. The older version of this generator had only 2 slip rings, but then an additional commutator. Now, this version here has a rectifier bridge, but no commutator. And the reason is that the commutator in the older version is part of an auxiliary DC generator, and that DC is required to power the field coils in the stator of this generator. And this generator here, not having a built-in DC generator, still requires a DC that needs to be fed into the field coils, and you can get that by taking a voltage from 2 of the slip rings, then feed that into a rectifier bridge, which then goes to the field coils. The wires are labeled and the enclosure is removed. These old shock absorbers are brittle and need to be replaced. This EL150 is just as nasty as the other one, and it also has to be cleaned using the same method as before. The same goes for the synchronous generator and even the insides of the electrical enclosure. This engine has no spark as well, so we can take care of the 2 identical engines alongside each other now. When you have a Barker's EL150 with speed regulator where you need to access the ignition, you first have to open the governor housing. The old seal is ruined now, but I will make a new seal with a special type of Loctite silicone that is oil and heat resistant. This is the actual centrifugal governor. As the engine spins up, the weights are pushed apart and they in turn are coupled to the throttle on the carburetor. This is how this governor can actually regulate the speed of this engine. Next, this fan cover is removed, and beneath it we find a flywheel. In the center of that wheel is a thin metal sheet that, when unscrewed, theoretically allows you to work on the ignition, but it is not very practical, and I want you guys to see something as well here. So I use this special puller to remove the flywheel. And here are the components of this inductor magneto: coil, cam, points, and capacitor/condenser. I first disconnect the capacitor from the points and measure its capacitance. It appears to be okay. I then detach the point assembly and grind off the surfaces of the points with some fine sandpaper until they make perfect contact again. This is something that I'm now doing whenever I work on old 2-stroke engines like this one. It appears to be the most common failure with these devices. After screwing the points back in, I use this 0.4mm gauge on this special wrench here to reset the spark gap to the correct distance when opened, of course. I did all this in the exact same way with both engines. And now we have spark again. The seals in the governor housings were redone with black silicone, and the governors were then filled with a certain amount of motor oil. In the meantime, the 2 identical carburetors were cleaned in an ultrasonic cleaner, dried and carefully reassembled. With this particular carburetor, there really is nothing to adjust but the idle screw, by the way. As long as they are clean, they usually just work. But I needed to do some more repairs here. The Stromer 85 has an asynchronous generator that works quite differently from what we have seen before. It just looks like your standard induction motor. Generally speaking, asynchronous generators don't work when they are not synchronized to a power grid, and it is not the first choice for an island type / off-grid system. However, this single-phase induction motor was built to be used in this exact role, and the way it works is that a capacitor bank is connected to the stator winding. The amount of capacitance is then determined experimentally for a given operating point. The German name for this is Kondensatorerregung, meaning capacitor excitation, and I actually found an old paper from the year 1935 that talks about this at length. I measured the capacitance of these two old caps that are just connected in parallel, and they are still within specifications. This burnt fuse here was wrapped in aluminium foil. Oh boy, I replace it with a new one. The bigger of the two units has a few more things that we needed to take care of. Parts of the enclosure are put into an acid bath. The sled and carry handles were wire wheeled and received a new paint job. The old muffler is also wire wheeled and eventually repainted with a high temperature paint. The old broken shock absorbers are replaced, and one of the little spanners that puts pressure on one of the brushes had come loose and needed to be reset. After taking care of these things and lots of other little details, it was time for the moment of truth, though. So except for some minor aesthetic improvements that I still have to take care of, the two generators are now back in running condition. The light bulbs are old 75 watt incandescent light bulbs, by the way. I use them as dummy loads because they need so much power. 20 75 watt bulbs are 1.5 kilowatts. With that same amount of power, you could run about 200 LED bulbs or so, just in case some of you have no idea how much 1.5 kilowatts even is. So let's see if we can get that tractor running again. First of all, let's appreciate what a hodgepodge of GDR technologies this actually is. The Barker's EL308 engine is from 1964. It comes with an original reduction gear and clutch. That clutch is coupled to an old transmission via a chain drive. I was able to identify that transmission as well. VEB Rohbohrwerke Zittau built several vehicles that use this particular two-speed transmission. One is the truck Rohbohr K30 and another one is the Rohbohr Varan, possibly some other models as well. Earlier, back on our road trip, we actually saw another vehicle by that exact manufacturer. The hubcaps say IFA Industriewerke Ludwigsfelde, and since I was curious what this axle came from, I contacted a museum in that city that takes care of the industrial heritage of that town. I got an email back that explained to me that this is the shortened axle of this curious vehicle that goes by the name Dieselameise, in English Diesel Ant. Also called the DK 2002, it was built at Industriewerke Ludwigsfelde between 1954 and 1956. To complete this beautiful picture, it just so happens that those farmers reused a sought-after collector's item on the engine's gas tank. It's a special edition cap made for Simson motorcycles. The tires were made by Barum in Czechoslovakia, by the way. Well, when that country still existed, that is. I started many of these repairs while I was still at my parents', so I didn't want to pull the tractor off the trailer just yet. So I decided to separate the engine from the frame of the vehicle while still parked on the trailer. As mentioned before, the engine is almost 60 years old, and it is one of the dirtiest specimens I've ever seen. It's a combination of oil, grime, grease, soil, and probably manure. I start once again by removing some parts like the old muffler and the incredibly dirty carburetor. This really is a piece of work. I later found out that it wasn't much cleaner inside than on the outside. I also separated the old gas tank from the engine. As is usual with old two-stroke engines, there is a thick layer of nasty goo inside there. But here is the gas cap, which actually belongs to a Simson motorcycle. After brushing off some loose dirt, I drenched everything in degreaser and started to clean everything manually once again. I also tried to drain the oil out of the gearbox, but of course there's nothing in there. I removed the gearbox and clutch, only to find even way more dirt under there. Even this do-it-yourself mounting plate needed to be hand cleaned. These small parts needed to actually disengage the clutch, needed some deep cleaning. The steel sheets that I had unscrewed from the motor went into this acid bath. After many hours of cleaning, it was time to have a look at the ignition here as well. The EL308 is the big brother of the EL150, by the way. It has many similarities, but when it comes to accessing the ignition, it's designed a little differently. Since this particular engine has no governor, there is less in the way here. This catch that is supposed to hold the starting lever is broken because of many violent starting attempts by former owners, and I will install a replacement. But first I take this dirty ratchet mechanism apart because more cleaning is necessary here. And then there is this little door here that allows us to have a look at the points without having to actually detach the big cover. So again, I use some sandpaper and reset the spark gap to 0.4 millimeters. The original carburetor is a little unpractical for a standalone test of this engine because the throttle is attached to the frame of the tractor. So I looked for another carburetor to test the engine, and as luck would have it, the big generator that runs on an EL308 came with some replacement parts. So the spare carburetor was once again cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner, dried and put back together. So I tried to start the engine. It starts alright, but it's still not running very consistently, and there's another much bigger problem. The massive handle is not original, and every other time I try to start the engine it kicks back with incredible force, and rather unpredictably so. It almost busted my knuckles, and I'm happy my head wasn't in the wrong spot when it kicked back. There is something not quite right here. So for reasons of my own safety, I decided to focus on the much newer replacement engine instead. The old engine is a 1964, this is a 1989, and from the looks of it, barely used. Once again, I cleaned the entire engine. I even decided to actually open the ignition and clean the points more thoroughly. Other than with the EL150, in the EL308, the ignition assembly is mounted on this removable cover rather than under the flywheel. So in this case, it is not necessary to pull that wheel off. Since this engine didn't come with a carburetor, I installed that replacement carb from the generator spare box on this engine instead. So, with this engine running, it was time to give that tractor at least some TLC before trying to run it. On top of the counterweights in the back of the tractor is a wooden box with some tools and spares inside. Nothing too interesting here, but it's kinda curious that they had so many spark plugs in here. I think that they never did any maintenance, clean or reset the points. They just screwed in a new spark plug every season or so. I think most of those plugs will still be useful, so I decided to clean them as well. Under that box we find a bunch of heavy steel plates that were used as counterweights. I removed them temporarily to make it easier to move the tractor around. While still on the trailer, I did my best to at least remove the brunt of the dirt. In many places a layer as thick as your thumb had piled up here. And then I rolled the tractor off the trailer. I installed the new engine on the tractor, and before that I had also swapped the gearboxes, had made a new seal and filled motor oil into the gearbox. The weight plates were also back on. I will now test this contraption, but keep in mind that I won't be able to control the gas lever from the back of this vehicle, because I haven't managed to properly clean the original carburetor yet. It is so dirty inside that neither an ultrasonic cleaner nor a bath in pure gasoline have helped. I'm still working on it. The replacement carb has a stationary lever, and no, the other gas lever doesn't fit on this carb. So all I have at my disposal to control the speed is the transmission. So don't be too surprised that it will get jerked around here until I have figured out how to handle this monstrosity. Yeah, so that was tremendous fun, and I'm so looking forward to do a complete restoration and build a trailer or at least a sulky to take her for a spin in an upcoming episode. And of course, there are more items to take care of. So if you liked this episode, then please give it a thumbs up. It's really important for me. By the way, this entire video was one of the most expensive and time-intensive episodes so far. About 20 days of hauling and repairs, followed by 4 days of sound recording, editing and research. That's easily 200 hours of work here. So in case you want to support that kind of effort for future episodes, please consider making a donation via PayPal, a link is down in the video description, or become a supporter on Patreon under patreon.com/tpai. See you soon. On our way I also make a detour through a small village called Holtheim. This is where my old workshop used to be. All the videos I made from 2014 to around 2016-17 were filmed in this house. When I first started filming my projects, I was thinking about calling the channel The Whole Time Inventor. Whole time, get it? Well, almost 10 years later, I'm happy I didn't do that. The inspiration for the actual channel name, by the way, came from the subtitle of the video game Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game. I changed it into post-apocalyptic because I didn't want to specify the exact nature of civilization's demise.